I'd like you to imagine something simple. A man is preparing for a long mountain hike. It is early morning and the air is cold. The path is still quiet. Before leaving, he places a backpack on his shoulders. At first, the weight is perfectly manageable. There is a few essential things inside: water, food, equipment, nothing unusual. And the man begins to climb. As the hours pass, the track becomes steeper. The man adapts naturally. The body compensates, the muscles adjust, the breathing changes rhythm, and somewhere along the way, something subtle starts happening. Without really noticing it, the hiker begins adding more and more weight into the backpack. A stone here, another there, a responsibility, an unresolved tension, a difficult conversation never processed properly, an expectation silently accepted, a pressure absorbed for someone else. The climb continues, because externally he is still moving forward. That is often how chronic pressure works inside leadership. It builds through progressive accumulation. At some point along that climb, a question becomes unavoidable. I have asked that question to many leaders over the years, in a quiet space, one-on-one, when talks about performance has been set aside for a moment. The question is this: if no one was watching, if no one needed anything from you, what would you actually put down? Most people pause for a long time before they answer. Some don't answer at all. The question is easy to understand. What makes it hard is something else entirely. They have been carrying for so long, they can no longer distinguish between what they chose to carry and what simply became part of them. Welcome to the Forge Conversations. I'm Alain Quadou, and this is Forge Conversations, a podcast dedicated to the phenomenon I call drift. Drift is the gradual and often invisible erosion that occurs when sustained pressure becomes normal and performance still appears intact. In these episode series, I explore one movement of the Forge framework at a time. The Forge framework is a 5-part architecture for leaders who want to rebuild something more durable than endurance. In the first episode, we explored focus, the shift from reactive noise to intentional signal, the discipline of directing your attention before choices are imposed by pressure. Today, we enter the second movement, overcome. I would like to begin by clearing something up. When most leaders hear the word overcome, they think of strength, more endurance, more discipline, more resilience, push through the wall, absorb the pressure, come out the other side. This is the dominant narrative in leadership culture, and indeed, some challenges do require us to dig deeper, to tolerate discomfort, or to stay present when everything in us wants to retreat. There is a different kind of burden, though, one that does not respond to more effort. One that grows heavier the harder you push. This is an unconscious accumulation, or everything that has been hard in the past and that you absorbed, integrated, normalized, and never set down. Imagine carrying the backpack. At first, you know every stone in it. You remember picking each one up. After months, after years, the weight becomes so familiar that you no longer register it as weight. It has become posture. It has become identity. And then someone asks you, why do you walk like that? You look at them, genuinely confused, because from where you stand, you are simply walking. We have all heard this language in the organizations where we work. I'm a reliable person. Others can count on me. I am a strong person. I always handle what needs to be handled. Those who say that are not complaining. These affirmations are often points of pride. And that is precisely what makes them difficult to examine. Now, I want to bring in something that psychology has understood for decades, and that organizational culture has been remarkably slow to absorb. Roy Baumeister's research introduced a concept called ego depletion. The self, he argued, operates like a muscle, and like a muscle, it fatigues. The more energy you spend overriding your internal state, the less capacity remains for everything else. It is the case when you are performing competence, when you feel doubt, performing calm, when you feel overwhelmed, performing certainty, when you feel lost. Aubert and de Gaulle-Jacques, two French researchers who spent years inside excellence-driven organizations, gave a name to what happens when that process runs long enough without interruption. They called it the internal burning. It is a specific illness. It reaches the leaders who refuse to acknowledge that they have limits, those who set an extremely high ideal for themselves and deploy maximum energy, physical, emotional, cognitive, to reach it, year after year, without ever questioning whether the ideal itself is still worth reaching. This burning is gradual. It installs itself in the gap between the self you've decided you must be and the self you actually are. And the wider that gap becomes, the more energy is required simply to maintain the appearance of coherence. Think about what this means for a leader operating under chronic organizational pressure. Every morning he reconstructs the version of himself he had decided he must be. Every meeting requires holding that version in place, regardless of what is happening internally. Every interaction demands the performance of a self that may, at this point, no longer be fully true. By the end of the day, the resource is depleted. The performance of that self, that specific exhausting labor, consumed what remained. This is a measurable neurological reality. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment, self-regulation, long-term planning, is highly sensitive to energy depletion. When that region is depleted, what emerges is the older, more reactive, more automatic self, the one that operates on pattern rather than intention. For significant portions of the day, the leader carrying the heaviest unnecessary burdens is operating from a version of themselves they would not choose if they had the energy to choose. Let me give you an example so this becomes more concrete. I think of a leader I worked with. Let's call him Thomas. 15 years as a regional director in the industrial sector. Consistently high performer, the one everyone called when something was genuinely difficult. By the time he came to coaching, he was still delivering, still available, still present in every meeting. He described something he called a lag, a slight delay between the situation and his response, as though something in him was operating a fraction of a second behind. And for the decisions that mattered most, he had started to feel, for the first time in his career, genuinely uncertain. In our early conversations, we began to map what he was carrying. The first thing he identified was a role he had been performing for over a decade. I am the one who never escalates. In his organization, there was an informal but powerful cultural norm. Senior leaders absorbed problems before they reached the executive committee. They solved, they filtered, they managed. Escalation was read as weakness. Thomas had internalized this so completely that he no longer experienced it as a cultural norm. He experienced it as a personal value. The automatic response to every crisis had become, I handle this, alone. I am not going to refer to upper management. The second thing was an older inheritance. His father had been an engineer in a large manufacturing company, a man of his generation who equated professional seriousness with emotional containment. Feelings were private, difficulty was private. You showed up, you performed, and you processed the rest on your own time. Thomas had absorbed this model so early that it felt like biology. He genuinely believed, at some level, that this was simply how serious professionals operated. Together, these two burdens, the organizational norm and the inherited template, were consuming an enormous amount of energy every day. The lag he described was the sound of a depleted prefrontal cortex, trying to make decisions without the resources it needed. Thomas is not unusual. The specific burdens vary, but the structure is remarkably consistent. Something was assigned by an organization, a culture, a family, a formative experience. It was internalized so thoroughly that it stopped being visible as an external imposition and became indistinguishable from identity. And now it runs automatically every day, consuming energy that could go towards something that actually matters. There are three patterns I see most consistently. The first is inherited expectations, the roles others assign to you, often early in your career, that you eventually stopped questioning and began to inhabit as your own. You are the one with answers. You are the one who stays calm when others don't. You are the one we can always rely on. At some point, these were external statements. At some point, they became internal commands. And now, even when no one is asking, you continue to perform them, automatically, exhaustingly, for an audience that, in many cases, no longer even exists. The second pattern is obsolete loyalties, commitments that once made complete sense to a team, a project, a structure, a version of your organization that no longer reflect the present reality. The context has changed, the organization has changed, you have changed, and yet you carry the emotional weight of those commitments forward, because releasing them would feel like a betrayal of who you once were. The third pattern is permanent over-responsibility, the compulsion, genuinely well-intentioned, to be the one who holds everything together, to absorb what others cannot carry. In small doses, this is leadership. In its chronic form, it is a drain that never closes. At some point, you volunteered to carry all of it, repeatedly, because you had lost the ability to locate the boundary between genuine responsibility and self-dissolution. Now here's an important psychological question that sounds obvious. If carrying these burdens costs so much, why don't we simply set them down? Aubert and de Gaulle described a mechanism they called the narcissistic contract. Here is how it works. The organization sends signals of recognition, visible signs that the individual is valued, that they belong among the excellent, that their contribution is seen and rewarded. In response, the individual projects an ideal version of themselves, a self that conforms to what the organization appears to want, a self that earns those signals. Over time, something deeper happens. The individual's identity and the organization's ideal image of them begin to fuse. The leader stops being someone who performs well inside the organization. They become, at an interior level, the organization's version of who they should be. When that fusion is complete, releasing a burden is no longer simply a professional decision. It is a form of psychological separation. The leader is not just putting down a way of working. He is detaching from the source of his own recognition, from the mirror that has for years told him who he is. This is the reason why intelligent, self-aware leaders, who can articulate every dimension of what is burning them out with complete clarity, still cannot release it. Information is present, understanding is present, the capacity to change is in principle present. The narcissistic contract holds anyway, because it offers something that exhaustion alone cannot displace. It offers an identity. There is a figure Aubert and de Gaulle also describe, one that the leaders I work with recognize instantly, even if they have never heard the term. They call it the mort vivant, the living dead. it is the person the organization does not eliminate, but gradually makes invisible. Still present, still employed, still technically functional. Assigned, however, to roles that carry no recognition, no visibility, no forward movement. The organization has, in effect, withdrawn the contract. The signals of excellence no longer arrive. Many of the leaders I work with are not primarily afraid of exhaustion. They are afraid of becoming that. And that fear, the fear of disappearing from the organization's field of recognition, is one of the most powerful forces keeping the backpack in place. Carrying the burden is exhausting. Setting it down risks the withdrawal of the only mirror that gave them a confirmation of their worth for the past years. That is the real weight inside the backpack. So what do we actually do about this? Overcome is not about becoming unburdened of everything difficult. Some challenges strengthen us. They develop capacity. They deepen our understanding of what we are made of. The critical distinction is this: does this weight still create something, or does it only consume? If a challenge exhausts you and at the same time expands you, if it has a developmental logic, if you can see its shape, even in the middle of it, that burden is a valuable one. If a pattern that drains you produces nothing new, returns to the same cycle each time, and survives only because you have forgotten to question it, that one should be set aside. The work of overcome is the development of that discernment. Overcome happens in stages which I will describe now. The first stage is inventory, as a genuine act of curiosity carried over several days. The question I give leaders to sit with is this: what do you carry that you would not wish to pass on? What is hard? Everyone can answer that. What you are responsible for? That list is also easy to produce. What would you not wish to transmit to someone you care about? That question cuts differently. It asks you to locate the burdens you recognize, at some level, as burdens, and the ones you have gradually mistaken for personality, professionalism, or leadership itself. The second stage is origin tracing. For each significant pattern, you identify the source with one simple question: where did this actually come from? Was it a deliberate choice you made with full awareness, or was it something you absorbed from an organization, a culture, a mentor, a family system, and then stopped examining because it became automatic? I think of another leader I worked with, a woman who had spent 12 years in a senior operations role across Asia. She had a reputation for being the person who delivered under impossible conditions, and she wore that reputation with genuine pride. When we began origin tracing, she identified something she had never examined directly. At 32, very early in her international career, she had been the only woman in a senior leadership team. That team was openly skeptical of her presence. She had to respond to that environment, which was questioning her legitimacy. She had decided in that context that she would outperform every doubt, that she would make herself impossible to dismiss. It was the right decision at the time. It was an intelligent and necessary adaptation to a real situation. 15 years later, she was still making it, in a completely different context, with a completely different team, in an organization that had long since stopped doubting her. She was still performing for an audience that had dissolved over a decade ago. When she saw that clearly, when she traced the pattern back to its origin and recognized that she had never consciously chosen to continue it, it had simply continued. Something shifted. The burden did not disappear immediately. Patterns that hold for a long period rarely do, but it lost its automatic quality. She could see it as a choice rather than a law. The third stage is selective release. a deliberate, specific, conscious decision to stop performing one pattern, just one to begin with. Thomas started here. He chose one meeting per week where he would not perform certainty. When he did not know the answer, he would say so, directly, without apology, without the usual scaffolding of projected confidence. The first time he did it, he told me it felt like stepping off a ledge. Nothing catastrophic happened, though. His team responded with something he had not expected. They started thinking alongside him rather than waiting for his conclusions. The dynamic shifted. He had stopped performing a version of strength that was consuming him and created space for something more genuine to operate. Now, I want to address the long-term dimension of this. What sustains many of these burdens is surprisingly difficult to notice at first. Over time, external pressure starts sounding like your own voice. The organization rewards a certain version of you. Your environment reinforces it. Recognition reinforces it. And eventually the pressure becomes internalized. You no longer feel that you are responding to expectations. You feel that this is simply who you are. But underneath that apparent certainty, there is often fear. Fear of disappointing, fear of losing relevance, fear of no longer being recognized in the same way. The alternative is very different. It is a way of working that feels aligned rather than imposed. A way of leading that reflects values you consciously chose instead of patterns you absorbed automatically under pressure. And the body feels the difference. When leaders stop spending enormous amounts of energy performing a version of themselves that no longer fits, something begins to regulate again. Clarity and recovery improve. Decision-making becomes less defensive. The nervous system is no longer paying the constant metabolic cost of self-suppression. The long-term work of overcome is building a relationship with your own motivation that is honest enough to sustain you across the entire journey of a leadership career. That requires returning periodically to questions that high-performance culture does not typically schedule time for. What do I actually value? Not what I have been rewarded for valuing. What kind of leader do I want to be? Not what kind my organization shaped me to perform. What would I continue doing if no one was measuring it? A leader who cannot answer those questions is a leader whose energy source is, at its foundation, borrowed, and borrowed energy eventually runs out. A second long-term solution is structural, the deliberate construction of recovery architecture. The nervous system recovers through cycles, through sleep, through pauses, through moments where vigilance finally stops. But many leaders slowly lose access to those recovery states. Availability becomes permanent. Rest begins feeling unproductive, and over time, the system forgets how to fully reset. What looked like commitment from the outside was often gradual depletion happening in plain sight. Recovery must become something intentional again, as regulation, as part of the architecture required for sustainable performance. For some leaders, this is genuinely unstructured time, empty space where the mind is permitted to wander without agenda. For others, it is physical movement completely disconnected from performance metrics. For others, it is the restoration of relationships that were deprioritized during the years of maximum pressure. What all of these share is this: they are incompatible with carrying the backpack. Recovery requires setting it down, long enough for the system to restore what sustained overload has depleted. I want to describe what I have observed in leaders who genuinely do this work. The first thing that returns is clarity, a quality of perception that was neutralized by the constant noise that produces self-maintenance, the ability to read situations more directly when it had been replaced, for years, by the distorted way of seeing that is produced by chronic pressure. The second thing is genuine interest in the work, the actual curiosity, the real engagement with problems and people and possibilities that was there at the beginning, before pressure turned it into obligation. The third thing surprises leaders most: the recovery of their own authority. The positional authority, the kind that comes from a title or a reporting line, was always there. This is different. The authority that comes from being genuinely present, from saying what you actually think, from leading from a place that is recognizably, authentically yours, rather than from the composite performance that years of accumulated expectation had assembled in its place. This is what Overcome is ultimately about. The recovery of a relationship with yourself that is honest enough and grounded enough to sustain genuine leadership for the long term. Let me come back to where we began. If no one was watching, if no one needed anything from you, what would you actually put down? Hold that question gently, curiously. Pay attention to what surfaces over the next few days. The leaders who sustain the longest, who maintain genuine engagement and genuine effectiveness across decades, are the ones who became honest at key moments about what they needed to put down. They understood that true capacity requires periodically returning to what you are actually carrying and choosing consciously what still belongs with you. The Overcome movement of Forge is about discernment. Know what is strengthening you, know what is merely weighing you down. Find the courage to tell the difference. In our next episode, we enter the third movement, Reinvent. Reinvent is the rupture point, the moment when the old self-model no longer fits and something new is waiting to emerge. We will explore what that threshold feels like, what makes it so difficult to cross, and what becomes possible on the other side. I'm Alan Coadou. I created The Forge because I believe that what happens before breakdown deserves as much attention as breakdown itself. That drift is absolutely not a weakness. It is what pressure does to human beings over time. I believe the ability to recognize it early carries something rare, the ability to sustain not just performance, but ourselves. If you recognize something of yourself in what we explored today, perhaps that's where the real work starts. And if you'd like to explore what recalibration might look like in your own context, you'll find me at alaincoadou.com. This was Forge Conversations. Thank you for listening.